On the same day that Brent crude settled above $100 per barrel for the first time since 2022, the Trump administration quietly issued a new license, not announced at a press conference, not celebrated on Truth Social, not presented as a policy achievement at a rally. Quietly, through the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, a license allowing countries to purchase Russian oil currently stranded at sea. Russian oil, the oil that American sanctions policy has been designed to restrict since February 2022. The oil that the price cap mechanism, agreed to by the G7, including the United States, was built specifically to constrain. The oil that the entire architecture of Western economic pressure on Moscow was constructed to make less profitable, less accessible, and less capable of funding the war in Ukraine. That oil, authorized for purchase. On the same day, oil crossed $100. The timing is not coincidental. The timing is the story. Because what happened on that single day reveals a contradiction at the center of American energy and foreign policy that the official communications apparatus is not equipped to explain, and that the mainstream coverage has not yet assembled into a single coherent frame. The president who spent months promising that the Iran war would be short, that oil prices would fall, that he would deliver cheap energy to the American people. That same president, on the day oil crossed the symbolic $100 threshold, authorized the purchase of oil from the country his administration has been sanctioning, whose war he has been nominally opposing, and whose leverage in global energy markets his entire stated foreign policy was designed to reduce. He needed Russian oil to rescue a market his own decisions helped break, and he authorized it quietly, hoping nobody would connect the two events that happened on the same day. By the time we are done here, you will understand exactly what the license authorizes and what it does not. You will understand why oil is above $100 and what the Iran war's drag on global markets actually means. You will understand the specific contradiction between this license and the Western sanctions architecture that American policy helped build. And you will understand what this quiet authorization tells you about the gap between the energy narrative the administration is selling and the energy reality it is managing behind the scenes. Welcome back. Today we decode the Russian oil license, the $100 oil context, the sanctions architecture it strains, and the three things the administration cannot say publicly about what it just did. Let's go. To understand the weight of what was authorized, you have to understand what Russian oil stranded at sea actually means, because the phrase sounds technical and the reality is geopolitically loaded. When Western sanctions on Russia were imposed and tightened following the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, one of the consequences was the emergence of what analysts call Russia's shadow fleet, a collection of aging tankers, often operating under flags of convenience from countries outside the sanctions regime, transporting Russian crude to buyers willing to pay outside the Western financial system. These vessels carry oil that Western companies are prohibited from insuring, financing, and in many cases purchasing under the sanctions framework. The stranded oil the license addresses is a specific category: Russian crude sitting in tankers at sea, unable to reach its intended destination because of port restrictions, insurance complications, or buyer hesitation created by the sanctions architecture. The license the Treasury Department issued creates a legal pathway for certain countries to purchase that oil without triggering secondary sanctions exposure, the mechanism by which Washington has pressured third-party buyers to avoid Russian crude by threatening their access to American financial infrastructure. Secondary sanctions are the enforcement teeth of the entire regime. They work by telling non-American, non-European buyers, if you purchase Russian oil outside the price cap framework, you risk being cut off from dollar-denominated transactions. For most economies, that threat is decisive. Dollar access is not optional for countries integrated into global trade. The secondary sanctions threat has been the primary mechanism keeping Russian oil revenues below the levels they would achieve in a fully open market. When the Treasury issues a license that carves out a category of Russian oil purchases from secondary sanctions exposure, it is not a minor technical adjustment. It is a modification of the enforcement architecture that the entire Western pressure campaign depends on. It is Washington telling buyers, in this specific category, the threat we have been using to restrict Russian oil revenues does not apply. Now the oil price context, because the license did not emerge from a policy vacuum, it emerged from a specific market crisis that the administration's own decisions contributed to creating. Brent crude above $100 per barrel for the first time since 2022. The Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's traded oil flows daily, has been effectively closed for weeks by the Iran conflict, with war risk insurance withdrawal making commercial transit economically impossible regardless of whether a formal blockade exists. The International Energy Agency announced the largest coordinated emergency oil release in its history, 400 million barrels, double the volume released during the 2022 Ukraine shock. Gulf producers have declared force majeure on supply commitments after infrastructure strikes. Canadian supply, routed through Trans Mountain to the Pacific, is flowing uninterrupted but cannot fill the scale of the global deficit created by Hormuz disruption. And the American Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the emergency buffer designed for exactly this kind of supply shock, was drawn down significantly during the previous administration and has not been fully replenished. That is the market environment in which the license was issued. $100 oil is not simply an economic number. It is a political problem of the first order for an administration that spent months promising sub-$2 gas and built a significant portion of its economic credibility on the claim that its energy policies would deliver affordable fuel to American families. When the promise was made, oil was around $70. The gap between the promise and the current market reality is visible at every gas pump in the country. And the political calendar, midterms 9 months away, makes that gap an urgent problem requiring a response that does not require the administration to publicly acknowledge that its own decisions contributed to the crisis. Quietly authorizing Russian oil purchases addresses the supply problem without requiring the administration to say out loud what it is doing or why. The license does not appear on Truth Social. It does not feature in a press conference. It moves through OFAC's administrative process, gets noted in the Federal Register, and generates a news cycle the administration presumably hopes remains confined to specialized energy and foreign policy coverage rather than reaching the voters watching gas prices climb. Now the sanctions architecture contradiction, because this is where the policy analysis becomes genuinely serious. The G7 price cap on Russian oil, set at $60 per barrel, was designed and championed in significant part by the United States Treasury Department. The mechanism was presented as a sophisticated tool that could simultaneously reduce Russian energy revenues, maintain global supply, and avoid the catastrophic price spike that a simple embargo would produce. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, during the Biden administration, described the price cap as a historic achievement in coordinating allied economic pressure on an aggressor state. The Trump administration inherited the mechanism and has nominally maintained it. The logic of the price cap depends on Western financial infrastructure serving as the choke point. Oil tankers need insurance. Insurance is overwhelmingly provided by Western, primarily London-based markets. Oil transactions need financing. Financing flows through Western banking systems. The price cap works by conditioning access to that infrastructure on compliance with the $60 ceiling. Sellers who price above the cap cannot access Western insurance or financing. Buyers who pay above the cap face secondary sanctions exposure. When the Trump administration issues a license that allows purchases of Russian stranded oil without secondary sanctions exposure, it is creating a precedent that the enforcement architecture will be relaxed when market conditions create political pressure for relaxation. That precedent matters more than the specific license, because the entire sanctions regime's credibility rests on the belief that compliance will be enforced regardless of market conditions. The moment buyers observe that sufficiently extreme market conditions produce relaxation, the deterrence calculation changes for every future transaction. European allies who built their own Russian oil restrictions in coordination with American pressure are watching this license with alarm. Ukraine's government, which has made Western sanctions on Russian energy revenues a central element of its warfighting strategy, is watching it with alarm. The message the quiet license sends to Moscow is that American sanctions policy has a relief valve, that when the political cost of maintaining pressure becomes high enough, Washington will find a way to reduce it. That message, once sent, cannot be unsent. Now, the three things the administration cannot say publicly, because understanding what cannot be said is as important as understanding what was done. The first thing it cannot say: our Iran policy created an oil crisis that is now requiring us to authorize Russian oil purchases to stabilize. The causal chain from the Iran military operation to Hormuz disruption to $100 oil to Russian oil license is visible to anyone who maps the timeline. Acknowledging it publicly requires acknowledging that the Iran operation had unmanaged economic consequences that are now requiring policy responses that contradict other stated American policy priorities. That acknowledgement is not available to an administration that characterized the Iran operation as a short excursion with manageable costs. The second thing it cannot say: we are reducing pressure on Russian energy revenues at a moment when Ukraine needs that pressure maintained. The Ukraine war continues. Russian military operations continue. Russian energy revenues fund those operations. Every barrel of Russian oil sold at prices above the sanctions intended level contributes to Russian warfighting capacity. The license does not explicitly authorize above-cap purchases, but it reduces the secondary sanctions deterrence that enforces the cap. And reducing deterrence in a stressed market environment where buyers are desperate for supply is functionally equivalent to relaxing the cap itself. Saying this out loud requires the administration to choose between its Iran policy, its energy price commitments, and its Ukraine support, a choice it prefers to avoid by acting quietly and hoping the connections are not made. The third thing it cannot say: we do not have enough non-Russian supply to stabilize oil markets without this. The administration has positioned itself as the champion of American energy dominance. Drill, baby drill, energy independence, the end of dependence on foreign oil. Acknowledging that a domestic supply shock requires quietly authorizing purchases from the country you have been sanctioning contradicts that narrative at its foundation. The license is an implicit admission that American energy policy, combined with the Iran operation's market consequences, produced a supply gap that American domestic production and friendly allied supply cannot fill on the timeline the political calendar requires. Here is the international reaction that is already forming, because the license did not go unnoticed by the governments watching American sanctions policy most closely. European Union officials have requested a briefing from Washington on the scope and duration of the license. The EU's own Russian oil restrictions are coordinated with American secondary sanctions enforcement. If Washington is modifying that enforcement framework without coordinating with Brussels, the coherence of the Western sanctions architecture, which depends on G7 nations acting as a unit, is compromised. Individual modifications by the United States create gaps that Russian exporters will root through regardless of European intentions. Ukraine's government issued a statement expressing concern about any relaxation of Russian energy sanctions and requesting clarification from Washington about whether the license represents a temporary market stabilization measure or a signal of sustained policy modification. The distinction matters because temporary measures, once in place, tend to acquire constituencies that resist their removal. The buyers who take advantage of the license while it exists will have economic incentives to lobby for its extension when the immediate market crisis passes. Saudi Arabia and Gulf producers who have been managing output in coordination with American energy policy goals are recalculating. When Washington authorizes Russian oil purchases to stabilize a market that American military decisions helped disrupt, it signals that American energy policy commitments are subordinate to American political calendar pressures. That signal affects every future production coordination discussion between Washington and Riyadh. Canada, which has been positioning itself as the reliable democratic alternative to politically volatile energy suppliers, is watching the license with a mixture of strategic interest and concern. Strategic interest because the license confirms the supply gap that Canadian Trans Mountain expansion is designed to fill over the medium term. Concern because the precedent of quietly relaxing sanctions to manage political pressure creates a template that could be applied to other aspects of the economic pressure architecture that Canada has been relying on as context for its own diplomatic positioning. Here is what the quiet license tells you about the gap between the energy narrative and the energy reality. The narrative: American energy dominance, cheap gas, oil prices falling fast, short excursion, no lasting economic consequences from the Iran operation. That narrative was the promise. The reality, $100 Brent crude. Hormuz effectively closed. Strategic reserves inadequate. IEA emergency release the largest in history. Canadian supply insufficient to fill the global deficit alone. And a quiet OFAC license authorizing purchases of the Russian oil that American sanctions policy was designed to constrain. Issued on the same day, oil crossed the symbolic threshold that makes the promise's failure undeniable. The gap between the narrative and the reality was managed by issuing the license quietly, through administrative channels, without announcement, hoping the connection to the Iran operation and the oil price threshold would not be assembled in a single coherent frame by anyone with sufficient audience to make the connection politically consequential. That calculation, manage quietly, hope the connections are not made, is itself a political signal. It tells you that the administration understands the contradiction clearly enough to hide it. Contradictions that are not understood do not get hidden, they get stated. The quiet management of the license is the evidence that the people making the decision know exactly what it means and decided that the market stabilization benefit was worth the political and diplomatic cost of the contradiction, provided the contradiction could be kept from reaching the audiences that would hold them accountable for it. Watch whether European allies formally protest the license modification through diplomatic channels. A protest would signal that the G7 sanctions coordination mechanism is under strain. Watch whether Ukraine escalates its concern from a statement to formal diplomatic engagement with Washington on sanctions policy maintenance. Watch whether the license gets extended beyond its initial scope as market conditions remain elevated. Extension would confirm that a temporary market measure has become a sustained policy modification. And watch whether any American official connects the license publicly to the Iran operation. The absence of that connection in official communications is itself the most revealing fact about what the administration understands about what it did. On the same day oil crossed $100, the administration authorized Russian oil purchases. 2 events. 1 day. And the story they tell together is the one the official narrative cannot accommodate.